In the midst of a high-stakes trial, a single hidden letter brought everything to the surface. What would happen when a 12-year-old girl read those words aloud in court, and the truth was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined? The bench was cold beneath her legs, the polished wood too hard for someone who had been sitting still this long. Emma Hart's feet dangled inches above the floor, her scuffed sneakers swinging back and forth in rhythm with the nerves buzzing inside her. She sat in the very last row of the courtroom gallery, pressed between strangers in business suits and quiet whispers, but it felt like she was alone in a different world. 12 years old wasn't that young, she told herself. She'd packed her own lunch since she was 7. She'd stayed home alone when Aunt Natalie worked late. She knew how to take care of herself. But this was something else. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the envelope in her lap, the old paper worn soft from being folded and unfolded so many times she'd lost count. Yellowed, creased, and sealed with a bit of tape that barely stuck anymore, it had once lived in the hidden inner pocket of a navy jacket she wasn't supposed to be going through. She hadn't meant to snoop, she never did. But the jacket had been shoved behind a row of winter coats in the upstairs hall closet, the kind of place where people hid things they didn't want found. It didn't even belong to her uncle. That was the first strange thing. Cameron Vale never wore navy. He liked black, crisp, fitted, expensive black. Everything about him was sharp. His jawline, his voice, the way he walked into a room like he already owned it. Emma had only met him a handful of times. Aunt Natalie said he was too busy to visit often. Running a company takes everything out of a man, she'd say, as if that explained why the man had a private jet but didn't show up for his sister's funeral. Emma didn't cry about that anymore. Not on the outside. On the inside was a different story. Now, the courtroom buzzed softly with murmured voices. Lawyers shuffled papers, people leaned over to whisper. The judge's seat remained empty for the moment. But Emma's eyes never left the man at the front. Cameron Vale. He sat straight backed at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly in front of him, his jaw clenched. Cameras weren't allowed in court, but Emma knew the news was still watching, recording, waiting to see if the brilliant billionaire CEO would fall. The envelope in her hand felt heavier than it should. She'd read the letter inside. Twice. Then a third time, just to be sure she hadn't imagined the words. It wasn't long. It didn't have a name on it, just initials. But it said enough. Enough to make her heart pound. Enough to make her afraid of what would happen if she didn't show it to someone. But who would believe her? 12 was old enough to notice things adults missed. Old enough to hear whispers behind doors. Old enough to know that people lied when it suited them. But still too young for anyone to really listen. So she waited, watching, heart pounding, hands trembling, and wondering how long she had, before someone realized the truth was sitting quietly in the back row, clutching it in both hands. Cameron Vale sat with his hands folded on the table, the cuffs of his charcoal suit just brushing the edge of the smooth oak surface. From a distance, he looked calm, collected, the way he always did in interviews, magazine spreads, investor meetings. But up close, you could see it. The tightness in his jaw, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his thumb pressed hard into his palm under the table, like it was the only way to stop himself from shattering into pieces. The courtroom lights were bright and cold. Nothing like the soft, curated lighting in his company's boardroom, or the expensive glow of the charity galas he used to attend. There were no cameras here, just notepads and eyes, watching, waiting, judging. He had built Valetech from nothing, a startup born in the back of a college dorm room, built on late nights, bad coffee, and a quiet obsession with digital security. By 34, he'd become one of the most talked about names in tech. Every magazine had called him a genius. Every investor had begged for a piece of his company. He'd given speeches at international conferences, shaken hands with senators, donated millions to causes his PR team said mattered, and now they were calling him a thief. The prosecutor's voice echoed in the courtroom as she listed the charges again: embezzlement, wire fraud, falsifying financial reports, words that sounded neat and clean, but carried the weight of prison bars and shattered reputations. Cameron didn't flinch. He'd heard it all already. He'd sat through deposition after deposition, watched the board vote him out, watched investors pull out, watched reporters drag his name through the mud. He didn't care about the headlines anymore. He cared about the truth, and about who had buried it so deep that even he had started to question what was real. He knew who had done it. He had no doubt. The numbers hadn't lied. The documents had been too perfect, too conveniently timed. Someone had planned it carefully, made sure the trail pointed to him and no one else. A betrayal this precise could only come from inside. And the worst part? He had trusted them, welcomed them, built with them. But proving it? That was the hard part. The digital paper trail had been scrubbed clean. Witnesses had gone silent. Files had vanished. Every attempt to trace the leak had led him back to himself. It was like trying to pull a knife from your own back while blindfolded. His lawyer whispered something beside him, a reminder about the timeline of events. He nodded, but his eyes didn't move. They were fixed on the judge's bench, still empty, focused, steady. The press had called him cold before, a machine, unfeeling. But this wasn't detachment, it was survival. He'd learned early that emotions didn't win battles. Proof did, and right now, he had none. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the proof he needed sat just a few rows behind him, in the hands of a 12-year-old girl with quiet eyes and a trembling envelope. She held the key to everything. He just hadn't looked back far enough to see it yet. The hallway closet upstairs didn't look like much. Just a long, narrow space, with coats lined up in neat rows, shoulders brushing, colors fading into one another. Most of the jackets were Aunt Natalie's, sleek and practical, labeled with tags from stores Emma had never been allowed to step inside. But the one at the very back, half covered by a plastic garment bag, was different. Emma hadn't meant to go snooping. She'd been searching for the extra set of rain boots, the ones Natalie swore were in the back closet, behind the gray parka. She'd moved aside coats and scarves, knocked over a small box of gloves, and then she saw it. A navy blazer, heavier than the others, the kind adults wore to important meetings or funerals. She pulled it forward, her fingers brushing the stiff fabric. The collar still smelled faintly like cologne, though faded and dry now, like old paper left in a drawer too long. She didn't recognize it at first. It didn't look like anything Cameron Vale had worn the few times she'd seen him. He dressed in sharp blacks, dark grays, with nothing out of place. This jacket looked softer somehow, not as tailored, not as expensive. She might have hung it back and forgotten all about it, except something in the lining scratched her fingers when she tried to smooth it down. There was a tear, small and nearly invisible, at the inner seam near the hem. Emma, curious more than anything, poked her finger inside and felt the corner of something thin and folded. She hesitated, heart pounding in that silly way it did when she knew she was about to do something she shouldn't. Then she tugged gently. The envelope slid out like it had been waiting for her. It was old, yellowed at the edges, the flap sealed with a strip of tape that had mostly lost its stick. No name on the front, just a short set of initials, L.M. Emma stared at them for a long time, lips slightly parted. She didn't know why, but she already felt like she was holding a secret that wasn't meant to be found. She should have given it to Natalie. That's what a well-behaved girl would have done. But something about the envelope, the way it had been hidden so carefully, so purposefully, told her that trusting the wrong person might be worse than keeping it to herself. So she slipped it into the pocket of her hoodie and walked quietly back to her room. That night, long after the house had gone still and the hallway lights dimmed to gold, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, and peeled the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting slanted and rushed, like someone had written it quickly or nervously. The words weren't long, but they were heavy. They talked about numbers not matching, about money moving in the wrong direction, about someone getting too close to the truth, about a plan that wasn't supposed to hurt anyone, but had, and at the bottom, in smaller writing, the line that kept her up for the rest of the night. If anything happens to me, this wasn't Cameron's doing. Please believe that. She didn't sleep. Just lay there with the paper in her hand and the name L.M. echoing in her mind. Because now she knew whose jacket that was. Logan Mays. The man who used to be Cameron Vale's business partner. The man who had vanished without a word 6 months ago. Emma stirred the cereal in her bowl even though she wasn't hungry. The flakes had gone soggy, floating in a circle like tiny boats in pale milk. Across the kitchen, her Aunt Natalie moved with quiet precision, placing files into a leather satchel, checking her phone, adjusting the knot of her scarf. Everything she did was crisp, deliberate, neat, just like the lines in her pressed blouse and the cold clink of her spoon against her own mug. They had lived together for almost 8 months now, ever since Emma's world cracked in half the night her mother didn't come home. There'd been a phone call, a car accident, and then silence where laughter used to be. Emma hadn't known where she'd end up. There was talk of the system, of foster homes, of long processes and temporary placements. But then, Natalie stepped in. "I'll take her," she'd said without emotion. "She's family." Emma barely knew her then. Natalie had always existed on the edge of things, present at holidays, polite at birthdays, but distant. She had worked for Cameron Vale, her mother's younger brother, for nearly a decade. Executive assistant, personal scheduler, fixer of all things messy and inconvenient. But she never really talked much about him, or about anything, really. Natalie kept her life organized, and her heart, Emma suspected, in a locked drawer somewhere she'd forgotten how to open. Now, Emma lived in Natalie's spotless townhouse, where everything had a place and nothing stayed out of order for long. Natalie provided food, clothes, and safety. But love was harder to find in the small, quiet spaces between them. "You have your science fair coming up, don't you?" Natalie asked suddenly, glancing up from her tablet. Emma nodded. "Are you ready for it?" "I guess," she mumbled. Natalie paused for half a second, then returned to her device. She didn't ask what the project was. Emma didn't offer. That was how most conversations went between them. Short, polite, unfinished. Sometimes, Emma wondered what her mother would think of all this. How she would feel knowing her daughter now lived with a woman who never smiled unless someone was watching. A woman who locked her home office every night and double-checked every light switch before bed. Emma didn't dislike Natalie. In some ways, she felt safe with her. Natalie noticed everything. She could tell if Emma had a fever before the thermometer beeped. She knew when a bill would arrive before the mailman even showed up. She always knew where Emma was and who she'd spoken to. It wasn't warm, but it was solid. Still, Emma kept secrets now. The letter from the jacket lived in her backpack, tucked behind a school folder. She didn't dare mention it to Natalie. Not yet. Not until she knew what it meant. Not until she could figure out why Logan Mays had written those words, or why nobody, especially not Natalie, ever spoke his name. "You'll be home right after school?" Natalie asked as she slipped on her heels. "Yes. Don't let anyone else in." "I won't." Natalie gave a small nod, then walked toward the door, her keys jingling like a warning. She always said the same thing before leaving, and Emma always answered the same way. It was routine. But lately, routine felt like a shield against something bigger, something Natalie wasn't saying out loud. The door clicked shut behind her, and Emma was alone again. She looked down at the cereal, now cold and unappetizing. She pushed it aside and reached for her backpack. There were things she needed to figure out, and she couldn't count on Natalie to help her do it. Not when her aunt seemed to know more than she was letting on. Not when her eyes, sharp and restless, always seemed to be watching. Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, the door to her room closed, her curtains drawn just enough to keep the morning light from spilling in. The letter lay flat on the quilt in front of her, its yellowed paper already showing tiny tears where the folds had worn thin. She'd read it again that morning, her eyes following the same jagged handwriting, each word pulling her deeper into something she didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. There was no greeting, no signature, only a small set of initials in the bottom corner, LM, written so faintly she hadn't noticed them at first. She hadn't needed to. She already knew who had written it. Logan Mays, her uncle's old business partner, the one who used to be in the photos on Valetech's website, standing beside Cameron Vale, both of them smiling, both of them younger, confident, invincible. The photos weren't there anymore. Logan had vanished 6 months ago, quietly. No press release, no farewell post, just gone. Emma traced the lines of the letter with her eyes, reading slowly, even though she already knew what it said. "They're shifting money without oversight," it began. "Internal accounts flagged for inconsistencies. Someone is either careless or hiding something. And if I'm right, it's bigger than anyone realizes. The board needs to know, but I can't trust them yet." She stopped there for a moment, the way she always did, heart picking up speed. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were written. Sharp, rushed, like someone scribbling in a hurry, not knowing if they'd get a second chance. Like someone who knew they were being watched. Further down, another line stood out in thick, underlined ink. "Leo knows too much." That part always made her feel cold. She didn't know who Leo was exactly, but she had heard the name before, not in conversation. No one around her ever spoke openly about the company anymore. But in passing, through thin walls, or when Natalie was on the phone late at night in the kitchen, whispering in clipped tones that always stopped the second Emma walked in. "I told Leo to keep quiet. He's asking questions again. He's going to ruin everything." Emma hadn't understood what any of it meant back then. But now, those pieces floated in her mind, like a puzzle without a picture. This letter, the name Leo, the money being moved, Logan disappearing. It was all connected. She picked up the paper again, holding it gently, like it might crumble if she touched it too hard. Why had Logan hidden this in a jacket instead of emailing someone? Why not go public? Why bury something so important behind a row of coats where it might never be found, unless he'd run out of time? Emma's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the letter. She didn't know who to trust. Natalie? Not with this. Cameron? Maybe. But how? He was on trial, being accused of the very things Logan warned about. If this letter was real, and every part of her believed it was, then he wasn't guilty. He'd been set up, framed by someone who knew how to cover their tracks. She glanced toward the door, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. Her eyes moved back to the envelope, now empty, but still heavy with meaning. The initials, the warnings, the whispered name, Leo, lingered in her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake. She didn't understand it all yet, but she understood enough to know one thing for sure. Someone had tried to tell the truth, and someone else had buried it. Cameron sat in the dim light of his home office, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across the room. It was past midnight, but he hadn't moved in hours. His inbox blinked with new messages, some from his lawyer, some from reporters, most of them demanding answers he didn't have. He typed slowly, carefully, reading every line before hitting send. But somehow, each time he reached out, things got worse. He had tried to reassure his legal team with facts, but facts no longer seemed to matter. The numbers had turned against him. Account balances he didn't recognize. Transaction records he never authorized. Email threads that looked like his words but weren't. And worst of all, the signatures, perfect copies of his, right down to the slight tilt on the letter C. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw headlines. Billionaire tech CEO under fire. Vale Tech founder faces prison. From genius to criminal. The same magazines that once praised him now tore him apart. The same journalists who had begged for interviews now chased quotes from anyone who'd ever met him. His assistant, Marla, had stopped answering his calls 3 days ago. She'd been with him for 4 years, organized every meeting, managed every schedule. She had cried when he gave her a Christmas bonus. But now, she was silent. His CFO, Leon Dunn, Leo, had taken a leave of absence the moment the charges surfaced. Cameron had emailed him twice, then texted, then tried calling. No answer. Just a voicemail that didn't even say his name. And then there was Matt, his best friend since college, the one who'd stayed up with him during those early coding nights, who'd helped him pitch the first round of investors, who knew the company as well as Cameron did. Matt had always been the calm voice in the storm, the guy who kept things human when everything else felt like a machine. But lately, even Matt had grown distant. His last reply had been stiff, formal, like a stranger writing from a template. "We're reviewing everything carefully. I hope this gets sorted soon." Hope. Not belief. Not trust. Just hope. Cameron leaned back in his chair, his shoulders aching. The walls of his office were lined with awards, framed headlines, patents with his name printed proudly at the top. He used to feel something when he looked at them. Accomplishment. Maybe even pride. Now, they felt like reminders of everything he had to lose. The evidence against him was airtight. Too airtight. That was the problem. Every piece fit together so perfectly, it felt like a trap. Like a machine designed to crush him without giving him a chance to breathe. The documents weren't just forged, they were strategic, thoughtful. Someone had studied him. Someone who knew his habits, his voice, his access codes. Someone close. That's what haunted him most. He hadn't just been betrayed. He'd been studied, measured, predicted. And as he sat there in the dark, staring at the email drafts he hadn't sent yet, Cameron realized the truth that was becoming harder to ignore. He was alone. Completely. Intentionally. Dangerously alone. The courtroom was full that morning. Every bench packed. The hum of quiet conversation echoing beneath the high ceiling. Cameramen waited outside, reporters hovered near the doors, and a low buzz of anticipation clung to the air like static. It was day 3 of the trial, and people were already calling it the fall of a genius. Cameron sat at the defense table, his eyes dull, his suit perfectly pressed. He looked like a man, trying to hold himself together with the last bit of thread he had left. His lawyer whispered something beside him, but he barely reacted. Across the aisle, the prosecution was organizing their papers, preparing to call their next witness. Everything was moving the way trials usually did, slow, careful, by the book. Until it wasn't. No one noticed the girl slip through the side door at first. She was small, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her backpack hanging off one shoulder. She wore jeans and a navy sweater, clothes that made her blend into the background, but the look on her face didn't match her age. It was focused, steady, as if she were walking into something she had already played out in her mind 100 times. Emma moved quietly past the benches, past rows of strangers, past Natalie's sharp gaze from the gallery. She ignored the whispers, the questioning looks. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she didn't stop. She walked all the way to the front of the courtroom and stood beside the witness box. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small but clear. The judge looked up, confused. "I need to read something." There was a pause. Then, before anyone could stop her, she reached into her backpack, pulled out the crumpled envelope, and unfolded the letter with both hands. "I found this in a jacket," she began, "in Cameron Vale's house. It doesn't belong to him. It belonged to Logan Mays, and I think it matters." A ripple spread through the room, soft gasps and murmurs rising like a wave. Cameron sat up straighter, his head turning slowly toward her. His lawyer stood, starting to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her speak," the judge said. Emma took a breath and began to read. "They're shifting money without oversight. Internal accounts flagged for inconsistencies. Someone is either careless or hiding something. And if I'm right, it's bigger than anyone realizes." Her voice shook slightly, but she kept going, her eyes never leaving the page. "I can't trust the board yet. Leo knows too much. If anything happens to me, this wasn't Cameron's doing. Please believe that." When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was complete. No movement, no whispering, just the hum of the lights, and the sound of a truth that had finally been spoken. Emma looked up at Cameron then, her eyes meeting his. For the first time he looked fully awake, like something inside him had been pulled back from the edge. The judge leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "Where did you find this letter?" Emma held it tightly, her fingers pressed into the paper, like she was afraid it might disappear. "In a jacket," she said. "A jacket that used to belong to Logan Mays. He's gone now, but he left this behind." And in that moment, everything changed. The courtroom exploded in noise the second Emma read those final words. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel slammed against the wood again and again, but it barely rose above the chaos. Attorneys on both sides were shouting, some yelling for order, others demanding the letter be dismissed, some rising from their chairs as if to physically stop what had already been said. Emma stood frozen in the eye of the storm, the letter still trembling in her hands, her eyes wide but steady. She had read every word exactly as they were written, her voice small but clear, even as the room tilted around her. Now she didn't know what to do. She had expected to be stopped. She hadn't expected anyone to listen. Cameron turned sharply toward her, his chair scraping against the floor. His chest rose and fell in deep, uneven breaths. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the girl, at her young face, her straight posture, her quiet bravery. It took him a second to process what he'd just heard, but when he did, it hit like a thunderclap. He knew that letter. Or rather, he knew the voice behind it, the style, the urgency. Logan Mays, the man he had once trusted more than anyone else. The man whose disappearance had created a silence too heavy to break. Cameron had thought about him for months, wondering what happened, where he'd gone, if he was even alive. And now, standing in front of him, a child had just read his last words. This wasn't Cameron's doing. Please believe that. Cameron closed his eyes, just for a second. He wanted to hold on to the sound of those words. Not because they saved him, not yet, but because for the first time in weeks, someone, anyone, had said he wasn't guilty. The prosecution was in a frenzy. The lead attorney was already demanding the letter be stricken from the record, calling it unverified, unreliable, completely inadmissible. The defense team, caught off guard, scrambled to regroup. Cameron's lawyer tried to shield Emma from the questions being flung at her like darts. But the damage, or the miracle, was already done. The judge raised her voice above the noise. "Enough! Everyone sit down!" The room quieted slowly, the weight of those final words hanging like smoke over every head. Cameron looked at Emma again. Really looked at her. She didn't look like a kid who had wandered into a courtroom by accident. She looked like someone with a purpose. Someone who had risked everything to tell the truth. And as he studied her face, a strange familiarity struck him. The shape of her eyes, the determined tilt of her chin. Then it clicked. She wasn't just a girl with a letter. She was family. His sister's daughter, Emma Hart. He hadn't seen her in over a year. Not since the funeral. She'd been so small then, quiet, and lost. He hadn't known how to talk to her. He hadn't even tried. And now here she was, standing in front of the courtroom with a piece of truth in her hand, doing what no one else had dared to do. Saving him. The judge looked down at Emma, her expression unreadable. "We will take a short recess," she said, her voice low but commanding. "And I want to speak with this young lady in chambers." Emma lowered the letter slowly, her hands still trembling, but her face calm. As she stepped back, she glanced one more time at Cameron. This time, he nodded. Not a thank you. Not yet. But something deeper. A beginning. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant click of heels. Cameron sat on a hard bench, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. He kept his eyes on the floor, still trying to absorb everything that had happened in the last 15 minutes. The letter. Emma. Logan's name spoken out loud for the first time in months. The judge had taken Emma into chambers to speak privately. The courtroom was in recess, but no one had really left. Everyone was still buzzing in the gallery, whispering in low voices, stunned by the interruption and what it meant. Cameron had heard one reporter call it a stunt. Another whispered that it might change everything. But for him, it wasn't about strategy or headlines. It was about Logan. 6 months ago, his co-founder had disappeared. Not in a dramatic way. No news reports, no police investigations, just a string of missed meetings and unanswered messages. At first, Cameron thought Logan had gone off the grid after their last disagreement. They hadn't fought exactly, but they'd argued over the merger with Apex Holdings. Cameron had wanted to hold back, slow things down. Logan had seemed edgy, nervous. He'd said something wasn't right, that people were pushing too hard, too fast. Cameron had chalked it up to stress. Then Logan was gone. The board claimed Logan had pulled out of the company after the failed merger deal and was taking time off. They showed Cameron a short message they said Logan had sent, a resignation with no emotion, no detail. At the time, Cameron didn't question it. He'd been neck-deep in legal reviews, partnership deals, and the weight of keeping Vale Tech from tipping over. But something about the letter Emma had read today, it hit him like a slap. Logan hadn't left. He hadn't run. He had been trying to warn someone. Maybe him. He leaned back and looked up at the ceiling, his chest tight. The signs had been there. Logan's sudden change in behavior. His late-night texts. The notebook Cameron found in his office once, half filled with financial records and names he didn't recognize. He had meant to ask Logan about it, but the next day, it was gone. Now, the truth was pushing its way through all the lies. If Logan had been writing letters and hiding them in jackets, it meant he had been afraid of being watched, afraid of being found out. It meant someone wanted him quiet, maybe forever. Cameron rubbed his hands over his face. Was Logan still out there? Or had someone made sure he wouldn't speak again? The thought sat heavy in his stomach. Guilt, sharp and aching, crept into his chest. He should have looked harder, should have asked more questions. Instead, he'd let the silence grow until it buried everything. He looked toward the courtroom door, still closed, and thought of Emma, that small, brave girl, with her mother's eyes and a backbone of steel. She had done what no one else had. She'd brought Logan's voice back. And now, Cameron knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had happened to Logan Mays, it hadn't been an accident. And it was time to find out who had tried to erase him. The moment the courtroom doors opened and Emma stepped back into the hallway, Natalie was there. She moved fast, her heels clicking sharply across the floor, her eyes flashing with a look Emma had never seen before, something too sharp to be concern, too frantic to be just worry. Natalie grabbed Emma's arm. Not hard, but tight enough to make her stop walking. "What were you thinking?" she hissed, leaning close so no one else could hear. Her voice was low, controlled, but it trembled at the edges like glass about to crack. "You can't just march into a courtroom and—" "I had to," Emma said, her voice steady. "Someone had to." Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced around, then pulled Emma toward a quiet corner near the elevators. Her grip didn't loosen. Do you have any idea what you've done? That letter should have been brought to me. You don't know what's really going on. Emma pulled her arm free. That's the problem. You never tell me what's going on. You just expect me to stay quiet and pretend I don't hear things. But I do. Natalie's expression twitched, the polished calm she wore like armor beginning to slip. She looked down the hall again, then back at Emma. You're just a child. There are things, complicated things, you wouldn't understand. Emma stepped back, her backpack bouncing lightly against her side. Try me. There was silence. Not the kind that came from not knowing what to say, but the kind that came from knowing exactly what not to say. Natalie's mouth opened, then closed again. Her hands smoothed her blazer, as if she could press the moment back into place, but it was too late for that. That letter, Emma said quietly. Logan wrote it. I know he did. And I know you knew him. You never talk about him. No one does. But you used to work with him every day. Natalie blinked, and for a second, something flickered behind her eyes. Regret? Maybe. Or fear. I don't know where you found it, she said, her voice flat now, rehearsed. But you're walking into something dangerous. People are watching this trial very closely. And if you say the wrong thing, I already said it, Emma interrupted. And it was the truth. Natalie didn't speak right away. Her hands dropped to her sides, and her shoulders fell just slightly, like something heavy had finally settled. You don't know what you're doing, Emma. You think you're helping, but you could get hurt. Emma held her gaze. You sound like you're trying to protect me, but it feels more like you're protecting someone else. Natalie's mask cracked just enough for a flicker of something to shine through. Something tired and brittle, and strangely sad. I've been trying to protect all of us, she said finally. But Emma didn't believe her. Not completely. Not anymore. The truth was sitting between them now, and for once, it wasn't her who looked afraid of it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't read that letter, Emma said, her voice calm. And I'm not going to stop just because you want me to. Natalie didn't answer. She just looked at her. Not like a child. Not even like family. But like someone who had just become a threat. Then she turned and walked away. No hug, no warning. Just the soft click of her heels fading down the hall. Emma stood alone in the silence, her heart beating hard against her ribs. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when the truth finally had a voice. Cameron sat alone in the courthouse conference room, the letter in his hands. The paper was soft and worn from where Emma had held it, the creases deep and fraying at the edges. He hadn't touched it until now. He'd watched Emma read it in court, heard every word echo against the walls, but it was different seeing it up close. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, quick, a little messy. Logan had always written like that, like his thoughts were too fast for his pen to keep up. Cameron read the letter once, then again. The words hit harder the second time, not just because of what they said, but because of what he had missed, what he had chosen not to see. The mention of money being shifted, of accounts being flagged, of someone named Leo. And that last line, Logan's final plea to be believed, even if he wasn't around to explain himself. It pulled Cameron back in time. 6 months, maybe more, to a meeting he barely remembered until now. Logan had come into the office late one night, unannounced, looking pale and tired, like he hadn't slept in days. His usual confidence had been replaced by something quieter, more urgent. He'd asked Cameron to talk, not in the boardroom, not with the others, just the two of them, behind closed doors. He'd paced the room while Cameron sat on the edge of the desk, confused and half distracted by the dozen things still waiting in his inbox. Logan talked about concerns, about numbers not adding up, about someone manipulating data behind the scenes. He mentioned the board, asked quietly if Cameron trusted everyone on it, if maybe someone had too much control. Cameron had waved it off, told Logan to take a few days off, get some sleep, Stop letting paranoia twist things that could probably be explained. He hadn't meant to dismiss him. He just didn't want to believe that something was broken in the company they had built together. He wanted things to be clean and simple. He wanted Logan to be wrong. But Logan hadn't been wrong. He had seen it coming before anyone else did. Maybe that's why he disappeared. Or maybe, Cameron realized with a hollow feeling in his chest, he hadn't disappeared at all. He folded the letter slowly, his fingers shaking slightly. Logan must have known he was running out of time, that no one was listening. So he'd hidden the letter. In a jacket? The navy one, with the gold buttons that he used to wear to meetings when he wanted to look sharp without trying too hard. Cameron hadn't seen it in months. He must have brought it to the townhouse the night of their last conversation, hung it up without thinking. And now it had become a message he almost never received. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, head in his hands. Regret crawled up his spine, bitter and sharp. He should have listened. He should have asked questions. He should have noticed that Logan was scared, but he hadn't. Now, a 12-year-old girl had done what he failed to do. She'd listened. She'd believed. She'd carried the truth into a courtroom full of people who had already made up their minds. Cameron looked down at the letter again. He wouldn't miss it this time. He would finish what Logan started. Cameron sat at his kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. The house was too quiet. It used to be filled with steady background noise, keyboards tapping, assistants checking schedules, voices drifting through the halls from video calls and meetings. But now, it felt like a shell, too big and too still. The kind of silence that made a man hear his own thoughts too clearly. He was rereading the letter again, even though he already knew every word by heart. The name Leo stood out more now than ever. It wasn't a nickname or a vague reference. It was a person. Leon Dunn. Leon had been his CFO since year 2 of Vale Tech. Smart, cautious, the kind of guy who double-checked every number and never raised his voice. They'd worked side by side through every milestone, every late-night spreadsheet session, every investor pitch, every financial audit. If anyone knew the truth about the company's money trail, it was Leon. But when Cameron's lawyer called Leon to testify in his defense, the answer had come back with surprising speed. Unavailable. No explanation. No return date. Just a short message through a firm representative saying Leon would not be appearing. Cameron didn't believe in coincidences anymore. He pulled out his laptop and scrolled through old reports, hunting for anything Leon had signed off on in the past 6 months. Transfers, approvals, budget adjustments. His name was on all of them. He'd had access to every corner of the company's financial system. And if Logan had suspected someone of shifting money in the dark, it made too much sense. But if Leon was part of it, why hadn't he just disappeared like Logan? Why stay quiet instead of clearing his own name? Unless someone was keeping him quiet. Upstairs, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor of Cameron's home office, surrounded by printouts and thick folders she had dragged down from the shelves. Cameron's old tech manuals lay open beside her. Guides on digital security, network mapping, data recovery. She'd found them tucked behind a row of binders labeled training docs and had started flipping through them late the night before, her eyes scanning each page with surprising focus. She didn't tell Cameron she was going to help. She just started. When he came in that morning, she had already drawn a crude map of Vale Tech's internal systems, sketched out with colored pencils on printer paper. She had highlighted sections labeled core servers, finance portal, and user logs. And now, she was cross-referencing Leon Dunn's company login patterns using a tool Cameron had built years ago and forgotten about, one that tracked when and how employees accessed the network. He stopped logging in 2 weeks before the trial started, she said without looking up. But before that, he was using remote entry to access the financial server almost every night. Same time window. Between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Cameron knelt beside her, his heart thudding. You found that using the old packet trace tool? He asked. Emma nodded. You said in one of these manuals that patterns are louder than passwords. He couldn't help it. He smiled. A small one, but real. I said that a long time ago. Still true, she said, then tapped the screen again. He was hiding something, but he made a mistake. He forgot that even silence makes a sound if you know how to listen. Cameron looked at her, and for a moment, he didn't see a child. He saw the daughter of his sister, a kid who had been through too much, and who still found a way to fight for the truth. And he realized she might be the one to uncover what grown men were trying to bury. Cameron stood outside the penthouse office of Evelyn Graves, the woman who had once told him she believed in him more than anyone else ever would. The polished brass nameplate on the door still gleamed. Chairwoman, Valetech Board of Directors. It was a title she wore like a crown, one that came with sharp suits, soft words, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and board deadlines with equal precision, who could offer a warm hug in one breath and cut you down with the next. He knocked once and stepped inside without waiting. Evelyn looked up from her desk, calm as ever. Her silver hair was pulled into its usual knot, her glasses perched perfectly at the bridge of her nose. Behind her, the city skyline stretched out like a mural of power and possibility. She smiled at him. Cameron, she said smoothly, I wasn't expecting you today. He didn't return the smile. He shut the door behind him and walked forward slowly, his voice steady. I know what you did. Her eyes didn't flinch. You'll have to be more specific, dear. These days, everyone thinks I've done something. He placed the folded letter on her desk. Logan's letter. The one Emma had found. The one that had changed everything. For the first time, Evelyn's expression shifted. Not fear, not guilt, just the faintest tightening around the mouth, like someone caught in a room that had suddenly grown too quiet. He wrote that before he disappeared, Cameron said, because he knew something, and he was scared. Evelyn's fingers traced the edge of the letter, but she didn't touch it. And what exactly is it you think I've done, Cameron? Buried a friend? Framed my own CEO? Why would I do that to someone I helped build? Because Logan was getting in the way of the merger, he said. And I was too. He didn't want to sell the company's backbone to Apex. He knew they'd gut our systems and flip us for parts. And you knew it too. That's why you needed him gone. And me, discredited. Evelyn gave a soft, almost maternal sigh. You're a brilliant young man, Cameron. But, like Logan, you have this romantic idea of loyalty, of legacy. Business isn't about clinging to old ideals. It's about staying alive. Logan couldn't accept that. And you, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap, were never supposed to dig this deep. He took a step closer. So you let him disappear. He made that decision himself, she said coolly. I simply helped ensure the transition was smooth. For everyone. Cameron's jaw clenched. You manipulated the board. You turned Leon. You forged records. You tried to destroy me. She tilted her head. I protected the company. And when it's officially merged next quarter, I'll have done what was necessary to ensure its future, even if it means crushing the people who built it. Evelyn stood slowly. This isn't personal, Cameron. It never was. But it was. And they both knew it. He looked at her for a long moment, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not the elegant mentor who once guided him through board meetings, not the warm voice who offered condolences at his sister's funeral, but the architect of his ruin, wrapped in pearls and polished manners. You'll lose, he said quietly, because now I know where to look. She didn't answer, but for the first time, she didn't smile. Emma sat on the carpeted floor of Natalie's study, surrounded by boxes of her mother's things. The room smelled like lemon polish and dust, like secrets held too long in one place. Natalie had told her the notebooks were just old journals, things best left untouched. But something had tugged at Emma's chest ever since she read Logan's letter. Something that told her the truth was bigger than just one warning, bigger than one man who disappeared. So, when Natalie had left the house for a meeting, Emma slipped into the study, found the boxes beneath the window seat, and started reading. Her mother's handwriting filled page after page, loopy, warm, familiar. Emma traced the lines with her finger, remembering bedtime stories and grocery lists and notes tucked into her lunchbox. But then she found it, buried in the middle of the third notebook, pages clipped together with a rusty paperclip. The ink was darker here, more rushed, the letters slanted with urgency. April 20. I tried to talk to Cameron again today. He listened, but only for a moment. He thinks I'm overreacting, that I'm reading too much into the financials. But I know what I saw. Logan is worried too. The numbers don't add up. Someone's hiding something, and it's not a small mistake. Emma's hands began to shake. She turned the page carefully, eyes moving faster now. They're using shell companies, layering transfers so they vanish. I've tracked it to accounts no one is supposed to know about. If I press further, I might lose my job. But if I stay quiet, Cameron could lose everything. I just wish he'd believe me. The last line was underlined twice. Logan said, "We're not the only ones who know. That someone inside the board is watching us." Emma sat back against the wall, heart pounding. Her mother had known. Long before the trial, long before Logan vanished, she had seen it coming. She'd tried to warn Cameron. But like Logan, she'd been dismissed, brushed off. It wasn't just Cameron's battle now. It never had been. Her mom had worked in accounting, quiet, smart, unnoticed. She had known where to look and what the numbers meant, and she had tried to do something about it. Emma pressed the notebook to her chest, blinking fast to keep the tears from falling. No one had listened to her mother. No one had listened to Logan. But they were going to listen now. Emma stood slowly, the second letter still folded in her hand. She could hear the front door opening downstairs. Natalie's voice calling out, cheerful, pretending. Emma quickly tucked the notebook into her backpack and slipped out the study's side door before she was seen. She walked down the street with her hood up, phone clutched tight, calling Cameron the second she turned the corner. "I found something," she said as soon as he answered. "Another letter. My mom tried to warn you. She saw it too." There was a pause on the other end. "Bring it to me," Cameron said. "We'll read it together." And for the first time, Emma didn't feel like she was just uncovering someone else's story. She was stepping into her mother's footsteps and finishing what she started. Emma waited at the edge of the parking lot, her backpack hugged tight to her chest. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, but she didn't move. She was watching the front entrance of Vale Tech, the way she remembered her mother doing when she was picking Emma up after school. Always scanning, always alert. She had agreed to meet someone here, someone her mother once trusted. Joseph Collins was the longest-serving employee at Vale Tech, a quiet man with soft eyes and hands that always smelled faintly of oil from the old elevator buttons he liked to fix himself. He had worked security since before Cameron even launched the first product. Most people overlooked him, but Emma had always liked him. He'd once given her a chocolate bar when she fell in the lobby and refused to cry. Now he approached slowly, his limp more noticeable than before, his cap pulled low over his brow. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her and looked out at the street as if they were both waiting for someone else. "You remind me of your mother," he said finally, his voice low and scratchy. Same eyes, same quiet way of watching. Emma said nothing, only looked up at him with a nod. Joseph reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive, worn and taped at one end. The label faded. He held it out like it was something delicate. "I found this the night Logan disappeared," he said. "Back stairwell. He came through in a rush. Didn't even say goodbye. Just dropped it on the floor when his bag tore. I picked it up and meant to return it, but he shrugged, letting the words trail off. Emma took the drive slowly, her fingers brushing his. Why didn't you give it to anyone? Because a week later, Logan was gone and everyone was pretending he never existed, Joseph said quietly. The board told us not to ask questions, said he'd left for personal reasons. But your mother looked scared. Real scared. She came to me asking if I'd seen him. I didn't tell her about the drive. I didn't know what was on it. I didn't want to get her in trouble. Emma swallowed hard. And after she died? Joseph looked down, guilt flickering across his face. I kept it in my locker. Figured if something ever really went wrong, someone would come looking. I'm looking, Emma whispered. Joseph nodded. I know. That's why I'm giving it to you now. You're the only one who still seems to care what really happened. Emma closed her hand around the flash drive, the weight of it heavier than it looked. She could feel the truth in it, humming like a wire pulled too tight. That night, in Cameron's home office, they plugged it in together. The screen lit up with files, encrypted folders, password protected, but Cameron recognized the pattern immediately. Logan's encryption style. He hadn't just made a backup of his findings, he'd left a full audit. A timeline, dates, names, bank transfers, internal access logs, all of it pointing to the same conclusion. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been theft, planned, executed, and hidden by people on the inside. Evelyn, Leon, two board members Cameron once trusted. The audit showed exactly when each transfer happened, who approved it, and where the money had gone. As the screen filled with evidence, Emma looked up at Cameron. You still think this is just about saving your company? She asked. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. Now it's about exposing the people who thought no one would ever find this. They had found it, and they weren't stopping now. The courtroom felt tighter than it had all week. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that settled over people's shoulders and made even deep breaths feel difficult. The jury was just minutes away from beginning their deliberation. Cameron sat quietly at the defense table, suit pressed, jaw clenched, heart racing. He had spent every second of the last few days trying to stay composed, but now, as the verdict loomed, he could feel the panic creeping closer. His lawyer leaned over and whispered, We've got one chance left. The judge hasn't dismissed us yet. We can try to admit the files. Cameron gave a sharp nod. His hand was resting on a folder, thin, plain, and filled with the contents of Logan's encrypted audit. Files decrypted and organized just hours earlier, thanks to Emma's determination and Joseph's forgotten flash drive. Cameron had spent the entire night studying them, cross-checking every figure, every name. It was undeniable. Everything they needed to prove he was innocent was right there. The attorney stood and addressed the judge, voice calm but urgent. Your Honor, we request permission to submit new evidence, material that directly challenges the foundation of the prosecution's case. The prosecutor immediately objected. This is last-minute evidence, Your Honor. Unverified, unreviewed. Cameron's lawyer held firm. These are financial records, internal logs, authenticated and time-stamped. And more importantly, we have a witness who can speak to how it was discovered. The judge looked skeptical. She had been fair throughout the trial, but cautious. Now, she rubbed her temple with one hand, her other resting on the bench. This is highly irregular, she said. We're at the end of proceedings. The jury is ready. Then Emma stood up. She had been sitting quietly in the second row, Cameron's jacket draped over her small shoulders. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Her jaw set. She stepped into the aisle and walked to the front before anyone could stop her. Please, she said, voice small but firm. Let me explain. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're not on the witness list. I know, Emma said. But I'm the one who found the first letter. I'm the reason any of this came to light. You should know why. The judge hesitated. She studied Emma for a long moment, then finally nodded. Proceed. Briefly. Emma stepped up to the witness stand, climbed the step, and looked out across the courtroom. Her voice shook at first, but she didn't back down. I found the letter in a jacket that used to belong to Logan Mays. It was hidden in the lining. No one knew it was there, not even Cameron. The letter said Logan found something wrong in the company, money being moved. It also said Cameron wasn't the one behind it. She paused, her eyes moving from the judge to the jury. I didn't really know Cameron before all this. He's my uncle, but we didn't talk much. After my mom died, I lived with someone else. I thought maybe he didn't care about me. But when I found the letter, I knew it mattered. I knew someone had tried to tell the truth, and I didn't want to let that truth disappear. She looked at Cameron then, her eyes steady. He didn't do what they're saying he did, and now we have proof. Please don't ignore it. Like people ignored my mom. Like they ignored Logan. The courtroom was still. The judge leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. I'll allow it, she said finally. Cameron closed his eyes. A wave of relief hit him like a tide, but he didn't let it show. Not yet. Not until the truth did what it was always meant to do. Save him. The room was silent as the jury filed back in. Each face unreadable, each step echoing against the floor. Cameron sat still, his hands resting on the table, palms damp, heart pounding behind his ribs like a fist trapped in a cage. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the reporters, or the judge, or the dozens of eyes watching from every corner. He looked at the small hand that had slipped into his. Emma's. Her fingers were curled tightly around his, knuckles pale, eyes focused straight ahead. The four-person stood, paper in hand, voice calm but loud enough to carry through the tension. We, the jury, find the defendant Cameron Vale not guilty on all counts. The room cracked open. It wasn't an explosion, not at first. Just a breath. A collective exhale from Cameron's legal team. A quiet gasp from the audience. The sudden shuffle of reporters grabbing for pens. Then came the louder sounds. Chairs scraping back. Hands clapping. A murmur rising like wind through trees. People stood. Some cheered. Others stared in disbelief. Cameron didn't move. Not right away. He just sat there, frozen, as the weight he'd carried for months began to slide off his shoulders. Slowly, he turned toward Emma. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she was smiling. Not the shy, polite smile she used around adults. A real one, quiet, but fierce. He squeezed her hand. You did that, he whispered. Behind them, chaos began to spread. Two uniformed officers approached Evelyn Graves as she stood stiffly at the end of the gallery. Her mouth was pressed into a thin, brittle line. She didn't speak as they took her by the arms. She didn't fight either. She only looked at Cameron one last time. No warmth, no regret. Just the cold understanding of someone who knew the game had ended, and she had lost. As Evelyn was led away, Natalie slipped out through a side exit. No one noticed at first. No one stopped her. She moved quickly, her eyes down, her expression unreadable. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't leave a note. She just vanished, as quietly as she had lived. Cameron stood slowly, Emma still at his side. He shook hands with his lawyer, nodded to the judge, tried to thank people who spoke to him, but it all passed in a blur. None of it felt as real as the small girl walking beside him, her grip still tight, her steps steady. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining, and the crowd had grown. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed, questions flew. Cameron gave one brief statement. Just a thank you. No anger, no accusations. The evidence had spoken for him. Logan's voice, even from the shadows, had cleared his name. And Emma, who had found that voice, had made sure it was heard. Later, they sat together on a bench at the edge of the courthouse lawn. The noise had faded. The world kept moving. Emma looked up at him, her face serious. What happens now? Cameron paused, watching the breeze tug at the leaves. He didn't have all the answers. Not about the company. Not about Natalie. Not even about what kind of family they would be now. But he reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't hesitate. Now, he said, we start over. She didn't understand everything that had happened. Not yet. But she understood enough. She had changed something, and there was no going back. The shovel hit the soil with a soft thud, the earth giving way little by little as Cameron worked beside Emma in the garden. The air smelled like fresh dirt and cut grass, and the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the estate's lawn. Birds chirped from the nearby trees, and somewhere inside, the gentle sound of music floated through an open window. Emma stood beside the hole they'd dug, holding the young tree between her hands. Its roots were wrapped in burlap, its leaves small and green, trembling slightly in the breeze. She looked at it the way someone might look at a secret they were finally ready to share. Are you sure this is the spot? Cameron asked, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. She nodded. It gets the most sun. He smiled and stepped aside so she could lower the sapling into the ground. They worked quietly, filling the hole, patting down the soil, making sure the roots were snug. It was a flowering cherry tree, one her mother had loved. Emma had picked it out herself. Said it reminded her of spring mornings when they used to walk to school hand in hand, her mom humming songs under her breath. Cameron had barely spoken to his sister in those last few years. Too busy building his company, too distracted by meetings and mergers. He'd missed birthdays. He'd missed quiet moments. He'd missed the chance to know Emma before her world fell apart. But now, as he knelt beside her, pressing soil around the roots of something new, he realized he hadn't missed everything. He still had this. They watered the tree together, Emma careful not to spill, Cameron steadying the can as she poured. When they were done, they stood back and looked at it. Small, fragile, but growing. It's ours now, she said quietly. Cameron glanced at her hair pulled back in a messy braid, at the dirt smudged across her cheek, at the spark in her eyes that hadn't dimmed even after everything she'd been through. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain, but something like hope. The weeks since the trial had been quiet, but full. Not in a dramatic way. There were no big speeches or sudden declarations, but in the little things. Emma coming into the kitchen every morning asking for toast. The way she left her backpack on the same chair each afternoon. How she sat beside him in the evening, while he read aloud from whatever book she picked. She started teasing him gently about how he always forgot where he put his phone, and he teased her back when she snuck cookies before dinner. The house, once cold and quiet, had come alive again. Sometimes, when he caught her laughing at something on TV or humming while she brushed her hair, he saw glimpses of his sister. And sometimes, when she looked at him without hesitation, he wondered if she saw glimpses of a father she could maybe start to believe in. She hadn't called him Dad, not yet, but she no longer called him Cameron either. These days, she just said, "Hey," or "you," or "Can we go get ice cream after dinner?" And honestly, that was enough. As they turned to go back inside, Emma reached for his hand without looking. Cameron didn't say anything. He just held on, his fingers wrapping around hers like he finally understood what it meant to be chosen, not because he had the right name or the biggest house, but because someone saw him and stayed. And in that quiet walk back toward the house, he realized he'd been given the one thing money could never buy: a family. Not by blood, not by obligation, but by choice. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.